We can start the party now.
Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. Just getting everybody into our Zoom room, and we'll get started here in just a sec.
I said it's in the speaker thing.
And you can see our speakers this evening have their videos turned on, so you can see some of their friendly faces that we have joining us this evening as we kind of get started here. And because we have a really packed program, as people kind of trickle in, I'm actually going to start my opening remarks now, just because I want us to have enough time to talk with everybody here tonight. So I think a lot of you know us as Historic Denver, but I just wanted to kind of formally welcome you. My name is Allison Salutes. I'm the Director of Community Programming at Historic Denver, and we are a nonprofit committed to telling Denver's diverse and distinctive stories. Many of you may be familiar with us 50 years ago when we saved the Molly Brown House, but since then we've continued to advocate for Denver's historic buildings as well as help unpack their stories. And the program this evening is part of our Empowered by Place series, which is a conversation about how Denver's historic places play an important role in our present. So fueled by current issues, we unpack them by discussing with local experts and encouraging our audience to take part in the dialogue. So this evening, that means all of you feel free to use your chat throughout the evening if you do have thoughts that you'd like to share with our speakers about our program this evening. May is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month. It's also Preservation Month. So it seemed like a perfect time for this particular conversation. And I'm so honored to be able to introduce you all to our speakers this evening. Before we get into that kind of part of the program, I am going to launch one poll. A piece of our funding comes to us through the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District.
Hey, Kitty, go.
And so if we're able to tell them where you all come from, that helps us when we ask them for funding. So I'll let that finish up right there as I actually move into introducing our first speaker. So we're going to start the presentation this evening with Jennifer Arrigo Charles. And I'm going to end that poll so it's not in anybody's way here.
Can everybody mute their speakers, please?
Thanks, Gil.
That wasn't me yelling at the cat. My cat went to sleep.
Perfect. So our first speaker this evening is Jennifer Arrigo Charles. She started in 2014 as the Endangered Places Program Director for Colorado Preservation, Inc., and then became the organization's executive director in 2016. She has a master's in urban affairs and public policy with a historic preservation concentration from the University of Delaware. So with that, I'm going to let Jennifer start talking about CPI's work at the Amache Relocation Center site.
Great. Well, thank you, Allison, and thank you to Historic Denver for hosting this important discussion. I think it's something that, we all need to talk about, and we're so kind of privileged to be able to talk about CPI's involvement in different projects at Amache over the years. I'd like to start with kind of an informal poll. I don't have the official poll up there, but maybe for anybody that's joining us, kind of on the bottom of your Zoom screen, you can choose something that's reactions, and maybe raise your hand if you've had the chance to visit and actually go on site to Amache before. We'll take a second. Okay, so a few of you. I hope by the end of this, we'll give you some strong reasons to get encouraged to go and experience it, because there's certainly nothing like being there in person. How many of you are really not too familiar about Amache and are learning about it for the first time? If you could use the reactions. All right, well, again, hopefully between all of us speakers, you'll have a real sense of Amache and why it's important to be saved and interpreted kind of for future generations, and all the excitement that we've got that's come out of Amache just this past year. So if we want to go to the next slide, Allison is kindly monitoring the slides for me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our organization. As I said, Colorado Preservation Inc. We've been around for almost 40 years. We're the statewide nonprofit historic preservation organization. And really, we help individuals and municipalities and organizations, at the heart of it, save the places that matter across our state. If you want to go to the next slide. A big part of our mission is promoting why these places matter and why they should be protected. And one of the ways we do this is really giving people an opportunity to visit some of these places, especially our endangered places, through either weekend workshops or trainings that we have throughout the year. And you see a few examples of people on site right there. There you go. You might be familiar with the term historic preservation, but at its core, preservation is about saving places and adapting places to keep them relevant for present and future generations. If you want to go to the next slide. And the next one. So CPI first became involved with Amache through one of our programs known as Colorado's Most Endangered Places. And really through this program, the public nominates significant places that are threatened in some way. And this year we're celebrating the 25th anniversary of the program. And over the years, we've listed about 130 places, and I would say about half of them are currently in active progress. Next slide. Our listed places are really located statewide, and they include everything from historic landscapes and places of agriculture and industry to entire downtowns, historic features, places of entertainment and worship. The power of place is something that we talk about a lot, and perhaps nowhere is the power of place felt stronger than at Amache. In 2001, when Amache was nominated to the program, John Hopper and his students at Granada High School were significant caretakers, promoters, and protectors of this important place. For those of you who have not had the chance to visit, it's located on Colorado's southeastern plains, about 2 miles east of the town of Granada. Rows of concrete foundations and overgrown vegetation remain as trace elements of the extensive network of buildings that once stood on this nearly 600-acre site. Next slide. And there you kind of see in 2002, those are just some kind of shots of Amache before a lot of the building reconstruction was done there. All right, next slide. So between August 1942 and October 1945, Amache operated as one of 10 internment centers established by the War Relocation Authority following President Roosevelt's Executive Order 9066, which authorized the exclusion and forced evacuation of Japanese and Japanese American citizens from the West Coast. The order was fueled by fear after the attack on Pearl Harbor and resulted in the internment of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans. And so you can kind of see here in the two maps, one that shows that exclusion area where they were forced to leave, as well as the states that have the 10 different internment locations, one of which is in Colorado. All right, next slide. So at its peak, Amache held 7,341 internees, making it the 10th largest city in Colorado at the time. In 1994, Amache was listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it became a National Historic Landmark in 2006. And of course, I'm sure you've seen it in the news this year as President Biden signed a bill that would move it forward to being one of America's newest national parks. So tonight, I know some of the speakers are going to talk a little bit more on the history of Amache, but I'm going to really look at the landscape itself and the efforts that have been undertaken to interpret and promote this important place. So next slide. So this slide shows kind of a map of Amache, which consisted of 30 barrack blocks, an administration area, a motor pool area, military police area, a hospital complex, and a warehouse area. And the next slide. The buildings themselves were hastily constructed between June and November of 1942 to prepare for the arrival of the internees. Over the next 3 years, internees adapted the buildings and landscapes to establish a sense of normalcy. In all, 556 buildings were constructed as part of Amache. Next slide. Once the war ended and Amache closed in October of 1945, the buildings were declared surplus by the government. The land was sold to the town of Granada, and the buildings were offered for sale in an effort to clear the site. Next slide. So many of the projects that I'm going to talk about today came out of funding from the Japanese American Confinement Sites Grant Program, known as JAX, that came through the National Park Service. This program specifically awards funds for the preservation and interpretation of the 10 confinement sites. These funds have been supported by contributions from Colorado's State Historical Fund, which granted over $500,000 in funds to date, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, the Gates Family Foundation, and the National Endowment of the Arts, to just name a few. And as you can see here, just as the funders are large, so are the list of players and significant stakeholders that have kind of changed and adapted over time. So, you know, this certainly doesn't list everyone that's been involved, but certainly a good majority. So next slide. So to start it all off, in 2007, the Friends of Amache organized a comprehensive interpretive plan that identified and prioritized future projects supported by the community. And this planning document really is what kind of guided all of the JAX grants and future funding that CPI applied for on behalf of the Amache stakeholders. So between 2010 and 2022, we've received 10 JAX grants for projects that were identified as priorities within the interpretive plan. Next slide. So as we said, you know, once Amache closed, the buildings were really put up for sale and advertised in local publications. You know, a preference for sale was given to towns, educational institutions, and veterans. Of the original 556 buildings, only 98 were sold and actually moved off-site. The remaining 458 were demolished by 1948. And then out of that 98 group of buildings that were sold, approximately half of them were dismantled and used for materials. So out of that, there really were only about 50 buildings that remained intact. So CPI received a grant from JAX to really start doing a survey. Next slide. For over about 2 years, CPI survey staff explored southeastern Colorado, including the counties of Baca, Bent, Crowley, Kiowa, Otero, Las Animas, and Prowls, as well as the adjoining states of Kansas and Oklahoma. And that's where we had seen a lot of research that kind of led to where a lot of these buildings would have moved to. Now, out of those original 50 buildings that we thought were still standing, we were able to identify 16 complete buildings that were located either on southeastern Colorado or really kind of the western Kansas area. Out of those that were left, 71% were found to have a high or medium degree of historic integrity, and about half of them were owned by entities that were willing to sell or donate them back to Amache. So you can see in these photographs here, these are just kind of a few of the properties that were located. And the hope that was out of this survey, we could either bring some buildings back or you know, have to recreate based on what wasn't in existence. So next one. So as part of this goal to interpret and bring back original buildings, the next phase was to really find a way to either reconstruct or bring back the guard tower and the water tank. Next slide. So these are some great shots of the water tank. You can see kind of from the platform of the water tank. That's where a lot of these early aerial photographs were taken. You can see its orange and white checkered pattern. That was very visible. It was actually the highest landmark in the area at the time. So certainly something that made people recognize from afar where Amache was. Next slide. Now, one of the amazing things was it was discovered that the original water tank actually still survived on a nearby private ranch about 20 miles south of Granada. And so the farmer decided to donate the tank to the Amache Preservation Society before he passed away. And this kind of shows you from 2009, 2010, what it looked like. And you can see with time, it started to deteriorate, but there were a lot of original features that were still there, including that GN, which is believed to, kind of note its location. Next slide. So due to the condition, it had to be really dismantled and moved, and it was rebuilt on site using as much original material as possible. And of course, reconstructing any elements that were missing or could not be salvaged. So these are just some kind of great shots of that process. And then the next slide. And then that shows you kind of as being, rebuilt the roof there and then kind of put on this new tower. I love that, that sunset shot. Next slide. And there you can see, the original foundation that was there where they kind of built the pillars for it and putting it up and together with the crane. All right, next slide. So near the water tank stood the concrete foundations of the guard tower. And the guard tower was one of 6 that was originally placed around Amache. And one of the features that is kind of uniquely characteristic to Amache is this octagonal design of the guardhouse. The original elements we couldn't find anywhere, so the tower was reconstructed using research, photographs, eyewitness accounts, and even some appraisal records. Next slide. Now, reports noted that the guard towers were equipped with searchlights and manned by military police guards armed with machine guns. The guard towers were constant visual reminders of the lack of freedom that was available to the internees. And this is a great shot that kind of shows a later project, the barracks, but the complete guard tower with even the searchlight in place that was, believe it or not, found on eBay. Next slide. And so over the years, interpretive signs were developed along with a driving tour and podcasts, and the different signs kind of looked at everyday life, different aspects of everyday life at Amache. Next slide. 10 stops were identified that really took people through the landscape, and you can actually still get a lot of this information. It's all on site still, as well as the website amache.org. There's a whole site dedicated to the podcast. So an important component to the interpretive plan was to give visitors the opportunity to step into a barracks to build appreciation for the cramped quarters and what it would have been like to have been there against your will. One of the original intents was to bring one of these original barracks that was identified in the building stock survey back to Amache. Unfortunately, as they started digging a little bit more, it was difficult to determine 100% that they did come from Amache, and specifically which block they would have been in and which foundation to put it on. So after a lot of discussion, it really was determined that instead of bringing an inappropriate building back to maybe its not original foundation, was to recreate a barrack building on site kind of at one block that was near the water tower as well as the guard tower. So you can kind of see on that bottom corner, that was one of the barrack buildings identified in Holly, Colorado, that initially they had hoped to bring back, but again, for those reasons, we decided to just reconstruct the barracks. All right, next. So this kind of shows you the barracks reconstructed. That great photograph in the middle, that was one of the weekend workshops that we had since the building was listed as one of our endangered places, the whole site. We brought volunteers on site. Some of the bricks were original and kind of relaying this brick foundation that, we had heard firsthand accounts of that made up the floor of the barracks. So that's them kind of putting it in place and then constructing the barracks and then it complete. Next slide. And then again, this kind of gives you a shot of the context of the area with all three structures in place. Next slide. And you can really see by, recreating and bringing back these elements, it really creates a specific environment that brings Amache to life and gives the visitor a new appreciation of place, something that's a little bit different than the rest of the location, which originally has, these foundations in place, but none of the buildings there. Next slide. So this is one of the exciting kind of newer projects. This is Recreation Building 11F, a historic photograph of it. Next slide. And here it is as it was in 2018. There were records that this recreation hall was purchased by the town of Granada when Amache closed for just over $400, $423.77. It was moved to the town park and eventually used for storage. What was great about this is that you can see in the middle there that 11F was kind of stamped on the outside. So based on that, it was very clear which block it was from and which foundation was the original foundation, with the intent that we would put it back on that foundation. Next slide. This is the context of it in sight in town. You can kind of see the interior there. Even though the condition's not pristine, it certainly had a lot of its historic integrity still in place. Not too much had changed. We did think that at some point the middle had essentially been cut out. Some of the thoughts were maybe when it was moved from Amache, they couldn't fit the whole building on a truck at the time, so they had to cut it to kind of fit. So part of it, when we moved it back to the foundation, was to reconstruct that middle section and kind of put the two end caps in place. Can bring next slide. So that shows the move coming out of town on the trailer. There's the original foundation. There was a lot of archaeology that was done ahead of time around the foundation, and some work kind of preparing the foundation for the building to be put back on. Next. And that kind of shows you the amount that had been lost, that cutout portion. So like I said, the grant supported building, a reconstruction of the middle section and then putting the two caps on. All right. So, those are kind of projects in the past. We do have some more projects that are currently kind of underway. There's a desire to develop further interpretation at the barracks and rec hall. So there's a grant for that in place, as well as to create a documentary film that will include recording of internees and their families. That will also include an educational component that can be put out to schools. And, the third part is the idea that this 2007 interpretive plan will need to be updated to kind of inform the goals for Amache moving forward. And next slide. In 2019, the National Park Service conducted a special resources study that lasted about 3 years with the purpose to determine if Amache would be eligible for inclusion within the National Park Service. And so to do that, they really considered its national significance, how suitable it would be as a national park, the feasibility of it being a park, and if there was a need for National Park Service management. So out of that study, it was determined that Amache was eligible. And then you see on March 18, 2022, President Biden signing the Amache National Historic Site Act, which established Amache as a unit of the national park system to preserve, protect, and interpret the site for the benefit of present and future generations. And then these last 3 slides, I thought, it might be nice for you to kind of see some of the legislators who were critical in pushing the bill forward in the House and the Senate, and just kind of what they had to say about its passing of the National Historic Site Act. So that's our portion of it, as Colorado Preservation, we're just feel so honored that we've been able to have a part in this story. And, I encourage you, if you haven't been to the site, please go take some time. There's nothing like really standing there and really feeling that historic landscape. So thank you.
Thank you. Jennifer, it's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And if folks have questions for Jennifer, feel free to park them in the chat and we can prompt her. Or if you're more comfortable unmuting yourself and asking directly, that's fine too. But that was a really lovely in-depth look at the work that's been done there. So I think that's wonderful. As we're waiting to see if there's any questions that are coming in the chat, I do want to introduce Gil. He is actually on the board of Historic Denver, but his bio is much longer than that. Gil Asakawa is a journalist, editor, author, and blogger who covers Japan, Japanese American, and Asian American and Pacific Islander culture and social justice issues. He's a nationally known speaker, panelist, and expert on Japanese American and Asian American history and identity. His journalism experience runs the gamut from being the music editor and investigative reporter for Denver's alternative weekly newspaper Westward and entertainment editor for the Colorado Springs Gazette daily newspaper, managing denverpost.com's website. He was appointed in 2014 by Mayor Michael B. Hancock to Denver's Asian American Pacific Islander Commission and served until December of 2020. He's the twice president of the Japanese American Citizens League and a founding member of Colorado Asian Pacific United, an organization formed to commemorate Denver's early Chinatown district in Lodo. So he's our speaker. He's also going to moderate our next two panelists. So everyone, this is Gil.
Wow. Well, thank you very much. Jennifer, I have to tell you that I learned so much about how those recreated elements at Amache got to Amache and about what Colorado Preservation, the CPI does. So thanks. I stand corrected and educated, and I also very early on, I think the first time I went on one of the pilgrimages to Amache, the food, the picnic wasn't at the school in Granada, it was in the park. And I saw the building and I thought, that's gotta be from the camp. So I went over there and looked in these dusty old windows and it was a storage shed, right? For all the park's equipment. But I could tell it was a tar paper exterior. And I could imagine people in there, playing guitar or reading or listening to like probably the one radio that was allowed in that block. And it brought, seeing the buildings really does bring to life the experience of the prisoners who were incarcerated in these camps during World War II. So, there's this long history of anti-Asian hate that started with against the Chinese in the middle 1800s. There was a anti-Chinese race riot on October 31st, 1880 that destroyed the thriving Chinatown that used to be in Lodo, just a few blocks from Coors Field and Union Station, just a few blocks from where Sakura Square is now. And then, when World War II happened, the Japanese, anybody of Japanese descent on the West Coast was rounded up, lost their homes, their businesses, had to leave their pets behind. So many heartbreaking stories. And Amache is, one of the legacies of that. And so I just wanted to show some pictures. You've seen some of these already. One of the things about all these camps was that every one of the 10 camps, incarceration camps, or as the US government referred to them, concentration camps, where Japanese and Japanese Americans were housed, had newspapers. They had baseball teams, they had football teams, they had Boy Scout troops, and they tried to live life as normally as possible. And we'll hear about the day-to-day life in the camps from our next two speakers. But I just wanted to show that, the pioneer was the newspaper for Granada, or Granada, as Japanese Americans call it. And you saw this picture of when they were closed, when Amache was closed in October of 1945. A lot of the pilgrimage events, when you first get to Amache, there's an annual pilgrimage, and I'll get into that in a second, but it's held in the little square plot of grass that was protected by the high school students at Granada School, who made up the Amache Preservation Society, organized by John Hopper, the social studies teacher, and now principal and social studies teacher. And at one point, the students saw that the cattle and whatever was trampling all the grass where the cemetery used to be. And there's really not a lot left, just a few markers for people like this, Masami Murakami, who lived one day or probably was stillborn. And all the rest of the graves, the bodies, the remains have been moved probably back to family cemeteries in California or Northwest or wherever they were from. But there's just a few forlorn memorial stones in this area. But there's also a large memorial for the people from Amache, the men who left to fight for the US government. And, try to wrap your head around that idea of your family is imprisoned in a camp behind barbed wire with guns trained on them, but you volunteered to go fight the Nazis and the fascists in Italy during World War II, or you've gone, you volunteered and you're now an interpreter working for the Pacific Fleet in the Pacific, fighting against Japan, which has a whole other level of complication. But you're doing this as your family is locked up, and it's hard to imagine that. I'm going to also now focus, because we're going to talk about day-to-day life in Amache and other camps. I'm going to focus now on kind of life in Denver. And these are two pictures of Japanese American community pre-war. The Colorado Times was a newspaper. Office was on Larimer Street. And this is a post-war picture of my wife's family, great-grandmother and grandmother, and in the post-war years in Denver. After they moved to Denver, they were not in Amache, but they were in the camps in Arkansas at the end of the war. And like a lot of Japanese Americans, they came to Denver in part because the governor of Colorado at the beginning of the war, Ralph Carr, who was a rising star in the Republican Party, was also a constitutional lawyer, an attorney from Southern Colorado, and he opposed these camps and rounding up Japanese Americans, and specifically Japanese Americans, the US born children of Japanese immigrants, because they were American citizens by birth. And he said it's unconstitutional to round up American citizens without cause. And, just saying a Jap's a Jap, which was one of the sayings that the general who was in charge of the incarceration said. Just saying that wasn't enough for Ralph Carr. He was supposed to be running for president at some point. He was on an upward swing in the GOP, and he totally lost his political career by opposing the idea of incarceration. But what that led to was that a lot of Japanese Americans after the war, they didn't want to go back to the West Coast where they'd lost everything. A lot of them, their neighbors said they would take care of their homes and stuff, but they turned around and sold everything right away. And so they didn't have a lot to go back to. They came to places like Chicago for work, a couple places in the East Coast, because for some reason, Japanese Americans were good at being chick sexers. They could look at a chick and tell what sex it was for the chicken, poultry industry. It's a talent, it's a skill. And a lot of Japanese Americans came to Colorado, both to be farmers and to work in Denver. And there was a period in the post-war years when there were dozens and dozens of Japanese American owned businesses along Larimer Street, from where Sakura Square is now, 19th and Larimer, all the way to like 35th, 36th and Larimer, in what's today Rhino, fashionably hip Rhino. And these are just some of the businesses. Angel Beauty Salon, Spring Cleaners, Umeya Mochi, which is a mochi pastry confectionery store, Frank Azuo's photo studio, the Griffin Hotel. There were several hotels, there were lots of restaurants, and it was a thriving Japantown. You know, a lot of these businesses eventually faded away as Japanese Americans did go back to the West Coast. But the community was still there well into the 50s and 60s. There was, excuse me, there was something called redlining. If you know about urban planning, there was a policy in many cities where people of color, communities of color, were relegated to certain neighborhoods, not the good ones, but the ones where, you know, the powers that be decided they should live. And so what happened was the Japanese Americans, like the Chinese before them in the 1800s, middle 1800s, ended up living in parts of Denver along with African Americans in Latinx communities. And so this is a quote from a city report that was given to, excuse me, Mayor, I think, Quig Newton in the 1930s, where it says, in addition, about 75% of Japanese businesses have been confined to the 20th and Larimer Street area. The wartime rise in feeling, this is after the war. Feeling against the Japanese was reflected in a unique for Denver type of discrimination. No business licenses for Japanese were permitted outside of District 8. Oh, I think it may have been World War I that was talking about. Although the licensing authorities say this ban has been lifted, it's significant that only 1 or 2 applications to do businesses outside the area have been filed so far by Japanese. So the Denver Police Department didn't hire Japanese because they didn't meet height requirements. One Ironworks company stated that the employment policy of the company is not to hire any Jews, Japanese, or Negroes. And JAs, Japanese Americans, weren't allowed to apply to beauty schools. Complaint was filed with a local agency declaring that all the Japanese American girls who applied to enter Denver beauty schools during 1945 and early 1946 were refused. The schools justified their refusals on the ground that such training was useless. So, you know, obviously they came back, they built a community, a thriving community, but still faced a lot of racism. These are some more pictures of post-war businesses, restaurants. Fred's Pool Hall on the right here, the taller of the 2 buildings, was renamed Akebono in 1961. Started out as a pool hall serving Chinese food, Japanese food, and American diner food. And the Aoki family who ran Akebono moved the restaurant across the street, across Larimer Street, because this was between 19th and 20th on Larimer. They moved across the street in 1973 to the new Sakura Square. Isn't that cool? And when my family first moved to Denver, we ate at Akebono in Sakura Square. The Sky Cafe was also on Larimer. And you know, look at this this big family and friends at the Sky Cafe. 20th Street Cafe sadly closed a year and a half ago during COVID. And this wonderful neon sign is still there. And apparently somebody's opening up something in there, but that sign is still there. And these are just names of some other businesses that were in the area. Minyasui Law Office. Minyasui worked for many years for the city of Denver. And in fact, Derek Okubo, who you will hear from, has taken over that position that Minyasui had for many years. I just wanted to show you a couple of pictures from Denver's Manual High School yearbook from 1952. They had a Nisei student organization, the Nisei Appreciation Club, in 1952. And the prom royalty for that year was an African-American young woman, and the attendants were Japanese American and Caucasian. I think that's really cool. And I think it's very significant. And, Derek, I should have left this picture. I had a separate slide that has Derek's auntie, who's also attended Manual High School. I have his aunt from the yearbook that year. Since then, through the 60s and 70s, the Japanese American community has celebrated its culture and community, its roots, and its Americanness, right? With the Boy Scouts and wearing kimonos for celebrations, a street dance called Bon Odori or Obon every year. It's shrunk down to the parking lot now instead of on Lawrence Street, but it's still an amazing sight, and it's cool to be doing these and learning these dances. Denver Taiko was one of the first 5 taiko drum band groups in the United States when they formed in the 1970s. This picture in the middle is my wife with her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. And mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother were all incarcerated during World War II. 4 generations in one picture here. Sakura Square, of course, is where the Japanese American community is centered today. It was built in 1972 by Colorado's second licensed Black architect. It's being redeveloped in the next few years, and it was named by Historic Denver as one of the 50 actions for 50 places sites last year. And I think people will be happy to see the new Sakura Square, which will continue to be a hub for the Japanese and Japanese American community, and in some ways, maybe even be more Japanese. So I'm looking forward to that. I'm currently working on a historic American buildings narrative to have documents and oral history on file at the Library of Congress for the National Archives about Sakura Square. So there's going to be a whole record of how Sakura Square was built, what it means to the community, and I think that's very important. So I mentioned the annual pilgrimages. It's the Saturday before Memorial Day every year. The first camp pilgrimage began in 1969 at Manzanar in California. It's the most famous of the camps because of the 1970s novel and late 70s TV movie, Farewell to Manzanar. But the first Amache pilgrimage was in 1976. This is a picture of the memorial that has the names of all the people who went and fought in Europe during World War II. This is kind of the crowd at the Granada school. Adele Arakawa, who is Japanese American, was for many years the most popular anchor on Denver News. Before she retired, she went and covered the Amache pilgrimage. Each year's pilgrimage is held the Saturday before Memorial Day, as I said, and you can go to amache.org to let them know if you're interested in going down there. They have a bus that goes down there, but it's already booked up. My wife and I drive down there typically every, when we can, and we'll be going this year for sure. This is Bob Fujigami, who was a child at Amache, and that's a picture of that guard tower and water tank with Channel 9 doing a story about it. This is an older picture of the Amache sign. I like it because it's just so funky. But, here's a picture of that constructed reconstructed, I guess, barrack building with the guard tower, and it's quite a sight. It's very inspirational to go there. Also, every February, around February 19th, which is the day on 1942 that President Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, which led to the incarceration of more than 110,000 Japanese Americans, or Japanese and Japanese Americans. The communities across the country hold a day of remembrance. The Mile High JACL, Japanese American Citizens League, has been doing this for a couple of decades now, and it's held at History Colorado. And Allison was very helpful to us at History Colorado when we first met her. And this is one of the speakers one year, I think 2018. And the focus was about incarceration of Japanese Americans, but also the family separation at the southern border during the previous administration. So this is an important day. Watch for that in the second week of February. The Day of Remembrance is a powerful event to go to. And then the Saturday before Memorial Day, please think about going down to the pilgrimage. This year really will be different and special because of the legislation that's been signed. Hopefully by this time next year, Amache, the land would have been deeded from the town of Granada to the National Park Service, and it'll be even more officially a national park site. And so we're all looking forward to that. But this year's pilgrimage, I wouldn't be surprised if some politicians happen to show up and give some speeches. I think it's going to be a big celebration. So it's going to be very, very powerful and a special day. So thanks for letting me talk your ear off. This is my blog. It's called nikkeview.com. I've written about the pilgrimage. I just actually posted today about some racist peanuts that are on sale at my local King Soopers that I was very disappointed to see. But, you know, that is what I have. And I am going to, Allison, should we just go straight into
Yeah,
talking?
we can do that. I was gonna say, there's a question in the chat from Erin that I thought you might be good to answer, which is she kind of loves everything she's hearing and was curious about specific hashtags or blogs, and I think you kind of just gave her one to learn more.
Oh, yeah. Nikkeview.com is my blog, or you can just Google. In general, you can Google Japanese American incarceration or internment, which is kind of the older word. The Japanese American community kind of made a commitment to say incarceration, but you can Google that. You can Google Amache, and there's tons of stuff out there. There's some good fiction books. There's some good histories. There's some documentaries. The city of Denver actually has in their storytelling series of videos. There's a video that has Stacy Shigaya, who will be speaking, and Derek Okubo, who will be speaking next. And they talk about the experience.
And actually, I have the link for that I'll put in the chat for everybody. I'll do it right now since it's pertinent.
That's perfect. And it's not a long video, but it's just great to get that background from the community. So yeah, I'm looking forward to this year's pilgrimage for sure, and I hope that we can see some of you. I know somebody on one person on this Zoom is from Washington, D.C. So Christina, I don't think you'll be there, but you were there last year. So thanks for going down there and visiting. And also I should mention that the Denver University has every other year they have an archaeological dig project at Amache. And this year will be one of those years where they'll have students all summer long, but you can contact Bonnie Clark at DU. You can go to the du.edu edu website and search for Amache. And they have a whole special section of Amache that shows a lot of the artifacts that they've found and things that they've done with the artifacts, exhibits that they've taken. And yeah, Christine Minami says that she highly recommends making the trek. She flew to Colorado last year from Washington, D.C., and she drove down there to Amache, and it is very powerful and worth the drive. But go to DU, look for the site, and you can even let them know that you're interested in going down there at some time for to see the dig. And Bonnie Clark and her students will show you what they're doing and things that they found. It's pretty amazing, actually. And I think as a national park, it'll make it maybe easier and more official to be able to do those kinds of things. I'm hoping that DU will be able to continue to do these digs because it benefits both the students and the community at large. So yeah,
that's
Uh,
great.
let's see here. Oh,
I
there's
can-
some, yeah, Allison, you're sharing some great
Yeah, and
links.
I can go ahead and introduce Derek if you want, Gil.
Sure, go ahead. I've been
'Cause-
talking too much.
No, that's okay. Derek Okubo is also joining us this evening. He's a Colorado native raised in Littleton. In 2011, Derek was appointed executive director of the Agency for Human Rights and Community Partnerships by Mayor Hancock. That was started in 1947 to investigate and address race and equity conditions at that time. So he currently oversees 8 city offices and 10 mayoral appointed advisory commissions. But his family background is his professional background is very impressive, but his family background is what we invited him here to share. So I'll let Derek do that.
Very good. Thank you, Allison. Thank you, Gail and Stacy, and thank you, Historic Denver, for hosting this tonight. And I want to thank all of you who have shown enough interest, to participate with us tonight. So what I'm going to cover here is just from the Okubo family perspective, as far as what their path was as far as prior to the imprisonment at Amache, and then post what happened there, and then afterwards. I will say that, Gil, it was kind of interesting when you're mentioning Quig Newton. Quig Newton was actually the one who started HRCP in 1947, and in that first study, they talked a lot about what initiated some of the study on race relations, that Denver was going through such a big transition at that time racially, and a large part of it was the influx of Japanese Americans from Amache upon the release a few years before. But let me just talk a little bit about the Okubo family history. This picture is a picture of my grandparents, Toshimune and Shizue Okubo. They were married in the early 1920s, not long after my grandfather immigrated to the United States, and through an arranged marriage, married my grandma. They started a store in Eagle Rock, California, and they were running that for a number of years, and they had a house. They had, at that time, 3 children, a daughter, Ruby, my dad, Henry, and a younger, the youngest at that time was Sachiko. And so of course, we all know December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor was attacked. The rumblings began at that time, and a lot of the fear. I remember my dad saying that he overheard his parents talking in the kitchen after Pearl Harbor, and a comment was mentioned that, I guess we're going to really have to become good Americans. And what that meant to him, I asked him what that meant, and he said, giving up our culture, giving up our language. And that was what the perception was as far as what they were going to have to do to survive. Well, a few months later, in February 1942, was when the Executive Order 9066 was issued by FDR. And it was about a month, maybe 5 weeks later, that they were relocated. They had to sell their house. They had to sell their store for pennies on the dollar. They could only take a small suitcase of belongings, so they had to really make choices. They could not take their pets, as Gil mentioned. They had to leave their dog behind. And so they were relocated. 3 generations of the Okubos, my great grandfather and great uncle and aunt, my grandparents and my dad and his siblings were all transported or relocated to Santa Anita Racetrack. So here they were, they had a house, they were moved into a horse stall, which was their home for the next 3 months. And after those 3 months in the summer of 1942, they were transferred to Amache by train. It was quite a long trip, and I remember my aunt, who was about 8 years old at the time, mentioned that riding there, they had to have the blinds pulled down. They could not look out. You know, her being an 8-year-old girl, peeked out behind the blinds, and she got yelled at by the armed guards that were there on the in the train cars. So upon they leave LA, they get off the train in Amache. And so now their home is a small barrack, small room in a barrack for 4 people. And it was 4 people because my oldest aunt, my dad's older sister, had contracted tuberculosis. And so she was placed in a sanitarium, and she was separated from the family for the entire time. So almost 3.5 years. And so that was quite traumatic and for her, because at that time, I believe she was 14 years old. And so she was separated from the family from 14 to 17 years of age. Let's see, my grandparents were in one area, and then the great grandparents and my great uncles were in the other. My aunt and uncle Jim were born in at Amache. They were interestingly and unfortunately, they both passed away from early onset Alzheimer's that hit them when they were about 60 years of age. And so we always wondered, was there something environmental at Amache that kind of triggered that early onset of Alzheimer's? I asked my dad, I said, what was camp like there? And he had this great quote. He just said that there is a fine line between hope and despair on a daily basis. And, you know, upon reflection, it makes a lot of sense because, you know, those of us who are parents and at that time, his parents were maybe in their early 40s at that time. And so they had these young children. So as parents, we can understand what that meant as far as a fine line between hope and despair on a daily basis, because they were trying to be hopeful for their kids, for my parents, trying to be positive, while on the inside, they were dying. You know, they just did not know. Here they were, they had this store, they had this house, all taken away. They did not know what the future held. So that despair that they were burying deep and that they were trying to hide from the kids was very profound. And that was how it was in our family. And I imagine it was like that for everyone. My dad would explain to me that the experience was quite different for him, being a 13-year-old. He was there from 13 to 16 years of age, than it was for his parents, because he was with his friends. And he did not have the same sense of loss that his parents were experiencing. So he was very clear that there was a very big difference between him and his parents' experience. The camps really caused, and at the assembly centers at Santa Anita and also at Amache, really caused a serious disruption to the nuclear family environment, because there were all the privacy that they once had, living in a house was gone. The kids wanted to spend time with their friends. There was a communal mess hall that they would eat at with food that was unfamiliar and would often make them sick. There was a communal latrine. It was a public showers and toilets as well. The living quarters were just one square room. I believe theirs was around 12 by 12 for 4 people. So it really disrupted any sense of nuclear family, the environment that they had. Still, though, they tried, the prisoners there at Amache tried very hard to create a community. They had community clubs, they had events, they had schools, they had gatherings, they celebrated holidays, that type of thing, despite the fact that they were behind barbed wire and with armed guards that were watching them. The kids, my parents, my dad and his sibling went to school, public school, and they had some very incredible teachers. My dad used to still talk about the teacher he had, who he credits with really changing his life and keeping his hope alive for the future. My grandparents worked in the fields and also did odd jobs as far as in the stores and in the schools. One thing that was unique about Amache is that they were very good as far as growing their own produce. And so there was a lot of agricultural work that was done right outside the barbed wire. My father graduated from high school early at age 16 because he said that during the summers you had a choice of either going to school or digging ditches. He dug ditches for one day and decided that he wanted to go to school instead. So he ended up graduating early, and upon their release in early fall of 1945, they moved to Denver. They had nothing to go back to in Los Angeles. They, like other community members, when they had some valuables, and they stored them in the Buddhist temple there in Los Angeles, which is now a part of the Japanese American National Museum. Well, the temple was broken into and looted, and all values from the Japanese American community were stolen. And so literally my family did not have anything to go back to. They could not afford to go back there because upon the release, all the prisoners, they were given $25 and a bus ticket to start their lives again. And so using that $25 and a bus ticket, they came to Denver and tried to restart their lives. So they moved to what Gil was talking about, the thriving Japanese town. At that time, it was not quite the Japanese town, but with the influx and the folks coming together and starting businesses. My family moved to that area around 20th and Larimer. Simultaneously, Gil also mentioned our Governor Ralph Carr. My mom and her family were imprisoned up in Minidoka, which was in Idaho. They had been originally from Seattle. They had heard that it was not safe to go back to Seattle, but it was safe to go to Denver. It was safe to go to Colorado because of Ralph Carr. And so they came to Colorado, and about 3 years later, or about maybe it was more like 5 years later, my parents met at a dance at the Buddhist temple, and had it not been for Ralph Carr, my siblings and I would probably still be out there in the ether. But upon coming back to Denver, my dad started college. His parents were really committed to try to get them educated, but he came home from college one day and found his parents and his siblings eating peanut butter for dinner. That's all they could afford. and it broke his heart. So he quit college, had his dad sign him up for the army so that he could get the GI Bill at age 7. He did this at age 17. And ironically, he was sent to Japan to be a part of the US occupation. That turned out to be a blessing in disguise because he was able to find his relatives who were homeless after Tokyo had been bombed out. And he would smuggle cigarettes off the PX and give it to them so that they could sell it on the black market. And they used that money to help restart their lives there in Tokyo. And my dad was also sending money back to his family here so that they could pool their money to start another store. And so in 1951, they were able to buy a Piggly Wiggly and open Ben's Supermarket, which was there at 28th and York. And so for 10 years, they ran that store. They sold it in 1962 or 61 and moved back to LA in 1962. But this store, it's no longer there. The building is still there. But this store was always a symbol to me and my family of the courage and resilience that my grandparents demonstrated to restart their lives with nothing, And I often asked my dad, I said, what was their motivation? I mean, through all the despair, through all the experience that they had, where did that determination come from? Where did that motivation come from? And he had another great quote, and he just said, sometimes the best form of revenge is to succeed. And in talking with my grandmother, when I asked her about the camp, I saw a face, a look that I had never seen before. And this was when I was about 22. And she just, it was a look of disgust, anger, and she just shook her head and got up and left the table. And so that response, without even any words, told me more about what she felt about the internment camps, concentration camps that they were imprisoned in. So when my dad told me this, it made all the sense in the world. The government tried to take things away. The US people tried to take things away. And so they were just determined to prove them wrong and to succeed. And that was their motivation. So just in closing here, I remember talking with there was a documentarian, Don Dexter, many years ago, and he did a documentary on Amache. And he said, tell me more about this experience that was defined the Japanese American experience in the United States. And I meant, you mean the internment camps, the concentration camps? He goes, yeah. I said, no, that was not the defining experience of Japanese Americans here in this country. The defining experience was that happened to them, very unjust, unconstitutional. The defining experience was that they did not let that stop them. They used that as a motivation. They used their anger as a motivation to move forward, to think about their descendants. Here I am, a generation and a half removed, and I've had the opportunities that they only dreamed of. I'm experiencing the life of an American that they had hoped for. And so that is the defining experience of the Japanese Americans in this country, is that determination that they demonstrated after this had happened to them. So with that, I'll close.
Wow, thank you, Derek. Very powerful and very moving. Although I've known your family story, and I've met your mom, and it's always powerful and emotional to hear it from you, and it humanizes that experience, that awful experience of incarceration, we're so glad and lucky that you're here in Denver to talk about Amache. So let's go to Stacy. I don't want to take up too much time here. We're kind of getting towards the end of our time, but Stacy Shigaya, let's see here. Derek, why don't you stop sharing your screen?
Yeah, let me try to get up there. There
And
we
then
go.
there you go. And then Stacy, why don't you tell us about your experience, and then maybe we can have a discussion, a few minutes of discussion and Q&A afterwards.
Sure. I'm very grateful to be here. I want to thank everybody for tuning in to this Zoom. My name is Stacy Shigaya. I'm a third generation Japanese American. It's called Sansei is what it's called. I am the program director for Sakura Square LLC and Sakura Foundation, which is what has been alluded to in the previous with Gil. It's at 20th and Lawrence. I am the proud mother of a son and a daughter, and the proud daughter of Ruby Sagara. Her maiden name is Fukuhara, and Doug Sagara. I'm going to talk to you today a little bit more about how the camp, being in a camp, affected not just my parents, but my family as well. My mom was born in Sacramento, and she was incarcerated at Topaz and Tule Lake. And my dad was born in Washington State, and he was interned at Heart Mountain, which is in Wyoming. So growing up, my parents raised myself and my two siblings. I'm the youngest I have an older sister and an older brother. And we were raised to be very Americanized. The three of us have Anglo first names, Anglo middle names. We were brought up in a Methodist church. It's Simpson United Methodist Church. It's in Arvada, Colorado. And fortunately for me, its congregation is mostly Japanese American. And so through the church experience, I was able to participate in some cultural activities like Hinamatsuri, which is Girls' Day. And that's one of the ways that my family kept the Japanese culture going within our immediate family. I remember asking my mom one day when I was probably in middle school, if I could take Japanese language lessons. And she kind of kept putting me off. And finally she said, no, it's kind of expensive. It's on Saturday and we'll have to drive you there. And so that didn't happen. And I wonder if part of the reason why it didn't happen is because my parents didn't feel a need for me to speak Japanese because they wanted me to fit in. They wanted my siblings and I to assimilate and not to be discriminated against or seen as less than because we were Japanese because of what happened to them. So, one of the things that has words or phrases that has come up recently is generational trauma. And if someone had asked me 10 years ago if I had experienced generational trauma from my parents being incarcerated, I probably would have said, oh no, not at all. But the more I listen to people, the more I hear people like Derek talk about his family's experience, the more I do definitely feel like there is generational trauma in my family. Derek explained to you about, things that his family members told him, and he has a lot of history in his family. And I don't have that in my family. I get kind of choked up like I am now. And I own if I start crying, I own these tears because when your parents go through something like the internment, where as has been stated before, you have committed no crime, you're called out because of what you look like and your ancestors, and and then you have to go somewhere, you don't know how long you're going to be there, you leave everything behind, you end up being in this desolate camp for 3+ years. That has a huge effect on you, obviously. Even though my parents were able to, after camp, meet and start a family and have a good life, they're both deceased, which is part of the reason why I get choked up. The way I see the experience of being interned affecting me is the way I was, my parents parented my my brother and sister and I. So for example, they would, there's certain things that they would say or do that at the time I really didn't think anything about it. But now that I'm older, I can attribute it to their experience of being in the camps, because when we would go someplace and my mom would be mistreated, or, we'd go to a restaurant and we wouldn't get good service right away. My mom's, her first emotion was they're discriminating against me because I'm Japanese. And so as a child, or mostly as a teenager, I would be like, oh gosh, mom, come on, that's not really what it is. But now I have a much better understanding of why she felt that way. My dad was very fortunate when in 1994, he was able to participate in a project to go to Heart Mountain and dismantle one of the barracks and move it to the Japanese American National Museum, where it is a permanent exhibit today. And that was something that at the time he was, proud to go do, but he didn't talk about it once he came back, and we really didn't give him the acknowledgement that we probably should have for doing something like that, because now thousands of people have gone through that exhibit and have seen what happened in the camps. And one of the stories that I found out secondhand was that during that project at the very beginning, when he walked into the barrack before they dismantled it, he looked up at the bare light bulb in the ceiling and was so overcome with emotion that he had to step out. And he was a kind of person when we were younger that he really did stuff those feelings in. So I couldn't have asked him questions that Derek asked his dad, because my dad would not have responded the same way. He probably would have not answered at all, is what my guess is, or just kind of, gave some kind of excuse to not talk about it. And so, part of the reason why, for me, it's so important that not just Amache, but the other 9 camps in our country be maintained, be given the status that they deserve. And I'm so grateful to John Hopper and the Amache Preservation Society for what they've done for Amache. But the reason why it's so important is because we've seen all these pictures from the slides, and you can go watch a movie, you can read a book, but as I think it was Gil who alluded to before, until you go and you step on that ground and you look out at how many barracks there were, that is something that's extremely powerful. And I was fortunate to go to Amache a couple of years ago. And even though it was a different camp than what my parents were in, it was so moving. And it was, it gave me a better appreciation and connection to what they went through. And actually another time that I had a connection to what they went through was at 9/11. When that happened, and people started discriminating against the people who looked like our enemy, that really this aha moment kind of clicked in my brain of that's what my parents went through, and that's how people were treating them, in a little bit different way, obviously, because of technology and whatnot, and the access you have to what's going on nowadays. But at any rate, that was something that was a real connection for me. And just to kind of wrap up the key takeaway I hope that you all have from this evening, and if you go read a book or watch a movie about the incarceration, and as a matter of fact, one book that's very new, it's called Facing the Mountain by Daniel Brown. I read it a couple of weeks ago, and it's excellent. He also wrote The Boys in the Boat, and that's a really well-read book that has come, I think it came out about 15 or so years ago, but it really gives you this feeling of being there, which is one of the things that's going to help us as a society to feel a better connection to each other, so that we can relate to each other. That's one of the reasons why it's so important for Amache to be a place where people can go visit, because we don't teach about the incarceration experience enough. I met someone in college from Arkansas where there are 2 camps who knew nothing about the internment, and I was appalled. And we can't bury the past. That history happened. So even if we don't talk about it, it happened and it had an effect on people. When we talk about Amache and the other camps, we're not doing it to dwell on it or to, because we want people to feel sorry for us. That's not it. We do it because we want to be diligent so that this doesn't happen again, and so that we honor the sacrifices that were made in the past. And learning from these stories and being able to talk about our history and embrace it and feel proud of it, even though our culture was, because of our culture and who we are, that was the whole reason for the incarceration. Embracing it and celebrating it and sharing it, personally, I feel like those are the ways that we're going to make connections with other people, to build bridges of understanding. And I hope that you all look at what your own personal histories are, share your stories with other people, learn more about what my family and Derek's family went through, and let's use all of that to be to help make our society better by making those connections and celebrating each other's differences, instead of pointing people out for their differences in a negative way, because those differences really do make our communities rich, makes our lives rich, and we all have something that we should be proud of, and we shouldn't be ashamed of it. So that's kind of my takeaway from this talk today, and I'm so happy to be here. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Stacy. Very eloquent. And I want to point out 2 things, and then see if we can squeeze in any questions from the audience. But to what Derek spoke about with family life in camps, if you look at any of the many pictures of camp life that were shot as kind of mostly shot as a propaganda for the US government. Dorothea Lange is one photographer who was hired to shoot those pictures, and she fought that. There's a great documentary about how her photos tried to humanize the Japanese Americans that were being sent off to camp. But if you look at all these pictures, especially of the mess halls and the families eating, what you'll see is older men, older women, moms, and some other older people, aunties and uncles, and young kids, like 3-year-olds to 8-year-olds, or maybe 10-year-olds. You do not see any teenagers, because all the teenagers were off on their own. It did ruin the nuclear family, because Japanese families at the time were very strict, and you had the grandfather or dad who would lay down the rules. And once the families got to camp, it was if you were a teen, it was your chance to go off and just be on your own with your friends and blow off your family. I think that was very damaging in some ways. So that's wanted to make sure that we kind of keep that in mind. And in regards to the intergenerational transmission of trauma, Satsuki Ina is a therapist from California who spoke at a Denver Day of Remembrance event back in, 2002 or 3 or 4 at the Tri-State Denver Buddhist Temple, and showed her first film, Children of the Camps. It's all about the intergenerational transmission of trauma, and because she was a kid, a young girl in camp, and she interviews these series of people who were children during this experience, and that was very powerful. And so this is and she's that picture I showed of Day of Remembrance at History Colorado in 2018. That was Satsuki Ina. She led a protest after that appearance in Denver, and a month later she was in Texas protesting at a camp, Crystal City, and then at a camp where separated, Latinx families were being imprisoned. But this idea of trauma is a very real thing. There were Japanese families who stopped speaking Japanese after the war. You can almost trace the disintegration of Japantowns up and down the West Coast because of the war and the Japanese community's need to assimilate and be as white as possible in the years after the war. So I think that was another step, and it's actually amazing that there's a generation of Japanese Americans now, fifth and sixth generation, who are pretty interested in their roots. Many of them are mixed race. Another byproduct of our need to assimilate is that the Japanese American community, of all the other Asian populations in the United States since the 1970s, we have had the largest, highest outmarriage rate. We married anybody but another Japanese person, much more than any other Asian community. And that's a sign of the trauma that we had to live with. So these are all real things that affected us.
Well, and I think unfortunately, there's probably plenty of people who can relate to my story of not knowing, my parents and what they went through. So as I get
Wouldn't
older,
talk about it.
Yeah, I realize that I feel like I've kind of been robbed of getting to know my mom and dad, because they were so traumatized that they didn't want to talk about what happened because they didn't want to burden us with it either. I'm just guessing that was what their thought was. Because we never had that conversation. They both passed, but I think that I sort of get resentful, and that's that generational trauma. And then the other thing that I think is really important is that the feelings that we're feeling and the repercussions of the internment are applicable to many other ethnic groups. The African Americans with slavery and people, Jewish people with the Holocaust. It's different levels, but it's still generational trauma, and it's still something that, again, we can look at and kind of stitch together our experiences so that we share them, and we have empathy for each other, and we don't look at each other as so different, and that's something that's going to heal us, I think, as a country.
It's also worth
our
go ahead.
indigenous community too, as far as the generational trauma. And I'll just say that the reason why my parents talked about it was for our own protection, because my brother was called a liar by his teacher when in elementary school, when he brought this up, and his teacher said, "That never happened, you're lying." Came home, told my mom, she went through the roof. And at the dinner table conversation was that my dad then said to my mom, we're going to have to talk about it. And so they ended up speaking with the principal and presenting on the camp to teach the teachers, which started my activism, because I saw it right in front of me. Activism isn't just screaming and yelling, it's acting, and it's to create change. And so I learned at a very early age what activism was about by watching them and how they responded.
Also worth noting is that when 9/11 happened, within 2 days, the Japanese American community across the country banded together and made public statements. In Washington, D.C., all these organizations made public statements of how, do not do anything to Muslims like you did to Japanese Americans. We stand with Arab Americans, and that was a very powerful statement on the part of Japanese American leadership, that we came out and said, this was a terrible thing, and you can't blame Muslims as a group any more than you could blame people of Japanese heritage. There was after all this paranoia about the Japanese and a Jap's a Jap, and spying and sabotage. There was not a single instance of Japanese espionage or sabotage during World War II, Japanese American in the United States. So, our community learned that lesson the hard way. And we really, within a couple of days, came out to defend the rights of Muslims and Arab Americans. I thought that was really important of us. So.
And now there's a big collaboration with the Japanese American community and the African American community for redress. That's a whole nother Zoom meeting, but that, again, that collaboration, because that shared trauma has this, this invisible tie between the two groups. And I think that's really important.
Cool. Sandra, thank you very much for this comment about Nikkei artist friends in the Bay Area who do activist art. So Naomi Judy Shintani, is that one person? I'll have to go check that out. And the time is pretty much up. Are there any questions or anything we can address very quickly before we go? Looks like we've.
Yeah, I think we were trying to answer some as we went that were coming up. And I think we got a few of the ones that were asked covered, but yeah, we do have a little bit of time if anyone does have an additional question for any of our panelists. I'm just so thankful for all of you for being here, for sharing your story. I think it helps so much understand what happened then, what happened, and now we know this kind of larger story of, we know there were families that were interned and then they came to Denver, but I think hearing these specific versions of that story make them so much more meaningful. So
yeah, and also keep in mind that this idea of distrust and hatred of Asians, including Japanese Americans, is not new, and it hasn't stopped. So there has been a spike in anti-Asian hate speech and hate crimes, especially since COVID, came upon our kind of common radar, and the idea of the Kung flu and all these racist terms, it makes it really easy to target Asians, and we end up being like, we're all just Asian, or we're all just Chinese. And I grew up with even as an adult, ignorant people yelling at me on December 7th, go back to Japan, go back to China, you sneaky Jap, remember Pearl Harbor. I can't tell you how many times I heard variations of that in my life. And it's just infuriating, but it still goes on, and different targets, anybody who's Asian. And, obviously we have many Asian immigrant communities now, many first-generation immigrant communities from Asia who are going through some of those same things that we all have as Japanese Americans. So reach out, like Stacy says, build some bridges, talk to people, and try to understand each other.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm putting a link to our event calendar in the chat. If you liked this program, we do Empowered by Place 4 times a year, so please join us for another session. And then, as we said, it is Asian American and Pacific Islander Heritage Month, as well as Preservation Month. So we do have a number of other preservation focused programs coming up that you might be interested in checking out. We recorded our program this evening, so we will have it up on YouTube, and we'll be sharing that with everybody that's registered. So if you missed anything or need to hear anybody's story again, you'll have that opportunity.
Thanks, Allison, for bringing us on, and Jennifer for teaching me about everything that CPI does. And Allison, I'll see you at some historic Denver event or board meeting or something soon, I'm sure.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Yeah.
all.